Unlike modern warfare, fighting a war on the scale of World War I in the early 20th century demanded overwhelming manpower as a primary requirement. When soldiers in the military fell short, young men volunteered for the service of their homeland. When that too didn't suffice, many nations had to take desperate measures to recruit men in the army. Conscription was introduced in many countries, and young men were taken into the military irrespective of their will. The British Army practiced an unusual PALS recruitment system to encourage men to join the army. This system allowed friends, family, and neighbours to enlist together in the recruitment drives and were promised that they would serve alongside their loved ones rather than being arbitrarily allocated to battalions. The system was very successful until the recruitment part. Some towns and villages had almost all their male population enlisted together in PALS battalions, but when such a battalion would go to the battlefield, almost all would die within hours, and consequently, the town or village where they came from would lose much of its male population immediately. For example, the city of Leeds had sent their men to form the Leeds PALS Battalion. During a battle, approximately 850 out of the 900 of their men either died, went missing, or got severely wounded. That's 94% of the regiment, all from the same city or town. Similarly, the Sheffield City Battalion lost 495 men in just one day in the Battle of Somme. This would create serious security issues in these towns that were now populated mostly by women and old men. Loss of manpower would shut down local industries, the major source of income of the town. Since an entire generation of young men had just disappeared from the town, a large percentage of the women population would never get married, and there was a surge of orphan children and helpless elderly people. The ramifications were so devastating that the scheme was soon called off, and battalions were disbanded or amalgamated. The PALS recruitment system was never repeated later in the war or in World War II. With similar motives, the British Army decided to lower its enlistment standards to recruit more men and formed Bantam battalions composed of men who fell short of the Army's minimum height requirement of 5 feet 3 inches. These enlisted Bantam soldiers were said to be as short as 4 feet 10 inches, which was not much taller than the standard issue Lee Enfield rifle that they carried. Since short height was no longer an issue, many underage young boys also found their way into the army. The battalions served in some of the hardest fought battles of the war and suffered heavy casualties. As the war progressed, Bantams were replaced by taller men, and these battalions lost their identity. The country that suffered the most casualties as a percentage of the pre-war population was the Kingdom of Serbia. It lost a total of 1.2 million inhabitants during the war, which represented over 29% of its overall population and 60% of its male population. To better visualize the disaster this country went through, the German Empire lost only 4%, the Russian Empire lost 2%, and France lost 4.3% of its population to the war. Much of Serbia would never recover, and people left the country to avoid economic downfall after the war. But things didn't turn out that bad for the Kingdom of Siam, now known as Thailand. After being neutral for 3 years, Siam declared war against the Central Power in July 1917 and sent troops to Europe to fight alongside the Allies. By the time troops had reached France and finished their training, the war had come to an end. However, a small number of their men participated in minor skirmishes in September of 1918. Siam lost 19 soldiers in total, all of them in accidents or disease, except for 2, who died before arriving in Europe. At the end of the war, they joined Victory Parade in Paris with other participating nations. Siam also participated in the Versailles Peace Conference and became a founding member of the League of Nations. Later on, it was rewarded with confiscated German merchant ships for its service in the war. During the Battle of Gaza in 1917, the unprepared British soldiers were having a hard time defeating the Turkish-German army who were defending the city. Their 2 prior attempts to enter the city had already failed. A British soldier and intelligence officer, Richard Meinertzhagen, then came up with a rather inventive plan that would later come to be known as the infamous Haversack Ruse. The plan was to place a dummy pocketbook containing falsified top-secret information in a canvas bag and plant it before the Turkish army. To further build the authenticity, things like fake letters from a fictional wife, sandwiches, and an expensive but worn watch were also included in the bag. Richard Meinertzhagen then delivered the bag by dropping it before the Turkish soldiers when they were chasing him. When the Turkish officials got hold of the fake documents, they were fooled into believing that the British forces would attack the more fortified part of Gaza only after the 7th of November, while in reality, the actual strategy was to attack the less guarded part on the 30th of October. As the second part of the plan, Richard Meinertzhagen asked his men to drop opium-laced cigarette packets in place of regular cigarette packets that were being dropped with propaganda messages over the Turkish army. When the right moment came, the British army surprise attacked the sleeping Turkish men stoned with opium, and capturing the city of Gaza became much easier. As interesting as this wartime story is, its authenticity is heavily disputed. A prominent source of the events is the diary of Richard Meinertzhagen himself, the kind of man that could not be easily trusted with his words. Investigative biographies published after his death present him as a fraud for fabricating stories of his feats, and speculated he was also the murderer of his wife. A large-scale theft and falsification in his ornithologist career were also revealed when it was discovered that the bird specimen he submitted as original discoveries were actually the ones he first stole from museums and collectors around the world. Nevertheless, the stories of the Haversack Ruse themselves had a huge impact on the events during World War II. It inspired Winston Churchill to create the London Controlling Station, which planned countless Allied deception campaigns during the war, such as Operation Mincemeat and diversions covering D-Day. Apparently, no other technological advancement in World War I proved as successful as the German submarines or U-boats. Over the course of the war, the Germans sank over 5,000 ships, losing only 78 boats in the process. Alone, U-boat SMU-35 sank 224 ships during its lifetime and then surrendered after the war. Many of the ships that sank were one of the biggest of their times and were considered unsinkable. However, when the SMU-21 sank its first ship, the HMS Pathfinder, in September 1914, it made the mighty British Navy realise that the threat was real. On the 22nd of April 1915, the German embassy placed a warning advertisement in newspapers informing passengers that boarding RMS Lusitania could be dangerous, as a state of war exists in British waters and vessels with British flags are liable to destruction in those waters. Despite the warning, RMS Lusitania, the biggest passenger ship of its time, set sail, and a week later it was torpedoed by the German U-boat SMU-20. The ship sank in only 18 minutes, killing 1,198 passengers and crew on board. Precisely how the ship sank still continues to be a mystery. Later on, it was revealed that the passenger ship was carrying heavy ammunition under the cover of passengers. This was against the law, as passengers weren't allowed to carry war supplies at that time. Public opinion around the world began to turn irrevocably against Germany, as this was before the time when the justification for the unrestricted killing of civilians was completely acceptable. This event ultimately became a reason for the US's entry into the war. But not all encounters with the German U-boats ended the same way. When the ocean liner Olympic, the sister ship of the Titanic, encountered U-103 on its way, she rammed into it instead of stopping. The German U-boat sank, and the ocean liner Olympic came out almost unharmed. This later supported the Titanic theory that it would have been a better idea to ram the iceberg with the Titanic instead of turning away to avoid it. Partway through the war, an artist and Royal Navy volunteer, Norman Wilkinson, came up with the idea of covering ships in bold shapes and violent contrasts of colour called Dazzle camouflage. This was the complete opposite of normal camouflage and was supposed to confuse the enemy rather than conceal the ships. Dazzle camouflage proved useful in combating submarine attacks as they made it difficult for observers to estimate the speed of the ship and its heading. A form of this technique is still being used in the auto industry to protect prototype cars from revealing details in design and aerodynamics. World War I was the first major conflict involving the large-scale use of aircrafts dropping death from the sky. And if you think that the life of a fighter pilot was any better than an army soldier fighting on the front, then you are mistaken. Sometimes it was even worse. Fighter pilots had no breaks. Pilots were not given parachutes to ensure that they would do everything in their power to land their planes safely, as aircraft were a lot costlier than pilots. Partway through the war, the Germans started issuing parachutes, but the Allies never did. At the beginning of the war, aircrafts had no guns attached to them, and pilots were shooting at each other using their pistols, shotguns, and even rifles in a close-range aerial combat called dogfight. They would stand up in their seat to shoot, however, their seats had no seatbelts, and there were many stories of pilots falling off their seats. Their training was equally sophisticated. In the British Royal Flying Corps, a person who could ride a horse and drive a car were considered a perfect candidate for pilot training. They were typically given 10 to 20 hours of air training before they were asked to fly to France on their own. But in many cases, recruits were only given 2 to 3 hours of training in the air. As a result, most RFC pilots lasted only an average of about 3 weeks once they arrived at the Western Front. This is why fighter clubs around the world name themselves the Suicide Club or 20-Minute Club, because this is how much the life expectancy of a new pilot in combat was in 1916 to 1917. The Peace Treaty of Versailles that ended the state of war between the German and Allied forces in 1919 contains an unusual demand under Article 246. Within 6 months from the coming into force of the present treaty, Germany will hand over to His Britannic Majesty's government the skull of the Sultan Mkwawa, which was removed from the Protectorate of German East Africa and taken to Germany. The context of this rather unusual demand is that Chief Mkwawa was a tribal leader who opposed the German colonization of East Africa and led campaigns that harassed the German rule for years. After he was surrounded by the enemy during a rebellion prior to World War I, he shot himself to avoid capture. The German scoundrels had his body posthumously decapitated and shipped to Berlin. Having fought for the British during the war, his tribe demanded the head of their hero back, but when this demand made its entry into the treaty, Germans disputed the removal of the said skull, and the British government took the position that the whereabouts could not be traced. The demand was raised once again after the German defeat in World War II. Inquiries speculated that Chief Mkwawa's skull could be one of the 84 skulls of East African origin that were kept in Bremen Museum. The skull, which showed measurements similar to surviving relatives of Chief Mkwawa, was shortlisted, and the one with the bullet hole was picked as the skull of Chief Mkwawa. After 5 decades of waiting, the skull was finally returned in 1954, and now resides at the Mkwawa Memorial Museum in Kalenga. World War I saw some of the biggest examples of heroism on the battlefield, but the story of Alvin Cullum York, or Sergeant York from the United States Army, is simply extraordinary. On its way to infiltrate German lines and silence a machine gun position, his unit was pinned down and suffered heavy casualties while capturing a bunch of German soldiers. Newly promoted Captain York then took charge and asked his remaining fellow soldiers to guard the prisoners and continued on his way to attack the machine gun positions all alone. He dispatched several German soldiers with his rifle, but by the time 6 Germans charged at him with bayonets, he was out of rifle ammunition, so he drew his .45 pistol and shot them all. When it was all over, he and his men had taken 35 machine guns, killing at least 25 enemy soldiers and capturing 132. York had single-handedly killed approximately 20 Germans and convinced more than 100 of them to surrender to him. The story of his feat was so extraordinary and hard to believe that an investigating team was sent to the area of the fight to find out the truth. The team later supported all of his claims. His actions made him a national hero, an international celebrity, and the recipient of a Medal of Honor. He was once described as the greatest civilian soldier of World War I. An interesting thing to note here is that Alvin York was a highly religious man. He initially resisted serving in the army on the grounds that his religion, Christianity, didn't allow him to take another man's life. However, he was conscripted into the army as an infantry private through the compulsory recruitment program. Even after the war, he remained a religious man and allowed for a movie to be made on his life only because he wanted funds to start his Bible school. World War I was the very first of its kind. The first major conflict among industrialized global powers that killed 10 million soldiers and mutilated over 21 million more. Europe suffered a bloodbath such as the world had never seen. But it is called the Great War, not only because it was huge and momentous, but also because it changed the nature of war itself. The bombardment of cities by artillery and aircraft obliterated the distinction between civilian and military targets. The war was further brought to civilians in the form of internment and genocides when ethnic minorities were suspected of disloyalty. The fighting turned even uglier when modern chemical warfare was born on the battlefields of Belgium in April 1915. Soon, it became a tolerated form of weaponry used by all combatants on a frightening scale. In 1918, 1 of every 4 shells fired on the Western Front contained poison gas, but the clouds of chlorine, phosgene or mustard gas didn't follow commands, as they were run by the wind's direction. It soon became evident that they would not bring any tactical or strategic breakthrough, but would change the rules of engagement. They served as a tool of horror that soldiers faced on the battlefield, the horror that would haunt the world for centuries to come. The Nobel Prize-winning novelist and writer of the famous Jungle Book, Rudyard Kipling, was an early supporter of the UK's involvement in the war. He wrote propaganda pamphlets and stories glorifying the British military as the place for heroic men, to encourage more men to join the British military. He had an 18-year-old son named John Kipling who wanted to join the British military, but every time he applied, his application was turned down because of his poor eyesight. Rudyard Kipling then used his good connections with the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army and got his son selected for the Irish Guards. On his very first battle, John Kipling possibly got a hit on the face and his body was never identified. He was declared missing since then. Rudyard Kipling wasn't the only father with such a fate. Of the 10 million military deaths, 5 million of the men who died in the war have no known graves. Finding bodies, let alone identifying and burying them, wasn't possible at places like the Eastern Front, where the war was fluid and covered large distances. Bodies of those who got makeshift cemeteries were pulverized and lost by unceasing bombardments as the war progressed. The war had now been transformed from a killing machine into a vanishing act. After his son's death, Kipling wrote these lines to reveal his feelings of guilt for sending his unfit son to war. "If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied." Many believe that these lines pointed towards the false promises made and lies told by nations before the war. The war that was fought as the war to end all wars, in reality, ended nothing. If it changed something, then it changed geopolitical boundaries, the science of killing, and the meaning of war. The peace treaty that came out of it in the end didn't seem to care about peace as much as it cared about keeping the losers on a tight leash and in poverty, a huge price of which would be paid in the form of the bloodiest conflict in the history of mankind, only a few decades after the end of World War I.